Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. So we're on our, final segment about the seventh and final emotional sphera, the sphera of the divine attribute of Malchut, of kingship or sovereignty. So that's the focus of today. Just to recap briefly, at least to name the first six attributes that we discussed in the last two segments. So the first set, which we call the primary emotions, is chesed. On the right side, you have chesed, loving kindness, which is expression, which is the desire to flow outward and become one with somebody else or something else. The left side is gevura. Gevura is the opposite. It's not a flowing outward, but returning to oneself in awe. When I'm afraid of something or in awe of something, I pull back. Or I respect. Respect is the opposite of becoming one, but respecting the other person's differences. That's on the left side. And the center, tiferet, which is beauty or harmony, blends the two and has an element of compassion to it, as we discussed. We then move to that's the essential emotional attributes. We then move to what they call the branches of the midot, the branches of the emotions. They're called the branches because they're not the primary emotions. And we said the right side would be victory, netzach, the desire that a person has, a tremendous amount of energy within their soul, a desire to be victorious, that in the face of obstacle, not to retreat, but to overcome. That's on the right side because also it's expression, it's related to self-expression. I want to persevere. On the left side, we had hod, which is splendor, or commitment or submission, which is committing to something greater than oneself. And then we had the middle was yesod, which is foundation, which is really connection, focused connection. And those are the six that we discussed in the past. And now we move to number 7. Number 7 is the most tricky and elusive to define exactly what it is because there's so much there, as we will discuss. But we'll jump right in. Malchut, kingship or sovereignty. So we'll divide, as we have done in the past, we'll divide the class in half. We'll begin with talking about the way Malchut is within the attributes of God, and then we'll focus on how Malchut expresses itself in the soul of the human being. It's a little bit different. They reflect each other as we discussed, but they have some differences. So we'll start with Malchut, the way it is within the divine attributes. So Malchut is kingship, sovereignty is the last sephira, the last emotional attribute of God. And in some ways, it's the most powerful because the creative power, the fact that God creates the world, is possible only through Malchut, only through the level of sovereignty. So in some sense, Malchut is the most powerful. On the other hand, Malchut itself almost is the least significant in a sense. And the reason for that is because the way the Zohar puts it, Malchut has nothing of itself. Malchut, sovereignty, has no light or has no energy on its own. All it does is it receives the light from the first 6 emotional attributes and then projects it outward. So when the Zohar refers to Malchut as the moon is likened to Malchut. Well, the moon does not have any of its own light. It reflects the light of the sun. Same as with Malchut. There's another metaphor for Malchut in the Zohar, and it alludes to it based on a verse from King David, who we believe was he represented the level of Malchut of sovereignty. Malchut is like a cup. So a cup doesn't have any liquid on its own. The cup can contain the liquid, it could transfer it, it could pour it somewhere else, but it must receive its flow from elsewhere. And later we're going to elaborate upon the fact that Malchut is also speech. So let's think about speech for a moment. Speech itself, the power to speak, the power of letters to convey, either letters of the mind, which is thought, or even speech is a better example, words. What are words? Words can be very powerful. But on the other hand, words themselves don't have any content. Most people when they're saying a word, when they're talking, there has to be some meaning in the words. Not everybody. There are some exceptions. Some people just talk and there's absolutely no meaning in what they're saying. Just kidding. But for the most part, what is a sentence? It conveys an idea. So think about it. Everything you will say today conveys either an idea or an emotion. So speech itself is like Malchut. It has nothing of itself. It receives the energy of the previous 6 emotional attributes, and then, like speech, it projects it outward. So that's the first paradox of Malchut. Malchut receives all the light from the other sphirot, and then projects it. So on one hand, it's very powerful. It's the sovereignty, as we will discuss, that Malchut has the creative power. On the other hand, it has nothing of itself. That's paradox number 1. If you look at Malchut as God's creative force, the light of Hashem that creates the world, so what happens with Malchut? Malchut is, on one hand, Malchut expresses a tremendous amount. It's God's creative power. On the other hand, it conceals as well. So Malchut also has a paradoxical idea. On one hand, it expresses, and on one hand, it conceals. So what's the metaphor? The metaphor is, let's say you have a tremendous amount of emotion. Okay? Either you love somebody and you tell the person, I love you. Okay, now ask yourself, is this statement that you just said, this sentence, is it revealing or is it concealing? Well, on one level, it's revealing. I'm letting you know what I think or how I feel. So there's a concept of revelation. On the other hand, the speech conceals. What do I mean the speech conceals? The speech could never express the intensity of which you feel, right? So the emotion, the way you feel it in your heart, is much more powerful than the way you could actually convey it in speech. To the extent that if a person is very emotional, what do you say? You say, I'm speechless. Why am I speechless? If I love you a little bit, I say I love you. If I love you a lot, I should say I love you many times. No, if I love you a lot, I say nothing. I'm speechless. Why am I speechless? Because even though words have the capacity to express, but on the other hand, they do not have the capacity to express all the intensity of the emotion that precedes them. So again, Malchut has this double component. On one hand, it receives all the light of the previous sphirot. It conceals the intensity of the light, and then it conveys a little ray. And that's how the world is created. You have all the light of God, the divine attributes are present within Malchut, and a little bit of that ray is spoken into this world, and that's the energy that creates the world. That's God's divine Malchut. Excuse me 1 second. I'm just going to pause here a little bit because I see I'm being called by my daughter. Okay, my apologies. So that is the 2 components of Malchut. Now let's talk about the metaphor of sovereignty for a moment. Like Malchut comes from the word king. And we refer to God as Melech HaOlam, the king of the world. So what is unique about this metaphor of king? The metaphor of king is interesting. For a king to work, for a monarchy to work, there has to be a certain distance between the king and the subjects. Right? The Medrash says, Ein melech belo am. You cannot be a king if you don't have a people. You cannot be a king over your own family. You can't be a king over your children. Why? Because the function of kingship means that you, as the king, are removed, are distant, are exalted above the subjects. Okay, that's the way it works with kingship. Why does it work that way? It works that way because within Hashem, it's the same way. If Hashem would give us, let's say, kindness directly, without going through Malchut, then we would feel overwhelmed by the expression of God's presence. for the world to exist, God has to be removed. God has to be concealed. So what conceals God is the Malchut, is the sovereignty. Sovereignty means he's not your father. He's not close to you. He's removed from you. If he's removed, he's giving you space to exist. And that's another component of Malchut. It has that double component. It conceals while it's expressing. As we said, just like speech. Speech reveals, but it also conceals the intensity of the emotions. The king rules the country, but he is also removed and distant from the country. God's creative power is, in one sense, it's imminent, it's present within the world. On the other hand, it's concealed. It conceals its intense power to allow us to feel our own existence. So that is Malchut, the way it creates. I'm just going to say one or two more points, the way Malchut expresses itself within God, and then we'll talk about Malchut within the soul of the human being. So, according to the Kabbalah, Malchut is the energy that creates the world, and the first 6 sefirot is the energy of God, the way God is within himself. And somehow or another, according to the Kabbalah, all of the Torah, everything we do, is what we're trying to do is we're trying to unify and create a marriage between the first 6 sefirot and Malchut, between the masculine aspects of God and Malchut, which is feminine, as we will discuss. So the point is, every time I do a mitzvah, what I'm really doing is I'm taking light from the first 6 sefirot, which is the energy of God, and I'm marrying the male component of God, which is the giver, to Malchut, to the recipient, and from Malchut it trickles down into this world. So that's why when you read the Kabbalah, you're going to read all about the yichud, the unity of the Kudsha Brichu, of the divine, the Holy One, blessed be He, and Shechinte and His divine presence, which is Malchut. One more component is that one more element is also the concept of Shabbat. What is Shabbat according to the Kabbalah? So the conventional interpretation of Shabbat is that, well, it's just a day that's a holy day that we don't work, and that's why it's a special day, so we have time to pray and to study and to spend time with family. The Kabbalistic definition of Shabbat is that on Shabbat, the energy of the world is different than the way it is during the week. And the way it works is as follows. During the week, Malchut, the attribute of God's sovereignty, descends to create the world. On Shabbat, the Malchut, which is the energy that creates the world, returns to its source, reunites with the first 6 sefirot, and that's when the marriage happens between the 6 sefirot and Malchut, the masculine and feminine aspects of God. And when it does so, the rest of the world is also elevated and reunited with God. So it's actually much easier to feel God's presence on Shabbat, according to the Kabbalistic wisdom, if we can tap into the energy of the world. So I'm just going to maybe say one more point, and then we'll open it up for discussion. One more point is that according to the Kabbalah, masculine, the masculine energies are the first 6 because they're the givers, and Malchut is the recipient. And therefore, when you want to draw down the 6 sefirot, you call it drawing down male waters, Mayin Dechurin. And that's when you study Torah. When you study Torah, you're taking the divine wisdom and bringing it down into this world. When you do a mitzvah, by contrast, what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is you're taking a physical object and raising it up to holiness. So what you're doing there is you're actually elevating what the Kabbalah calls Mayin Nukvin, feminine waters. It's the recipient, it's the physical world going upward back to its source. And that's why with the Torah and the mitzvah together, we create the unity between Kudsha Brichu, the Holy One, blessed be He, and Shechinte and His divine presence. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the Malchut, the way it is within God. We'll take a question or two, and then we'll go more practical and say, what does Malchut do for us, and how do we use it in our soul, in our life? Because Malchut, in addition to being a God's power to create, is also a part of our soul and is part of our toolbox of how to live a good and fulfilling life. Now we will try to think about what does it mean, Malchut, within the soul powers of the person. What does Malchut mean in my life, and how do I channel my Malchut to better my environment? So Malchut, as we said, Malchut is tricky. On one hand, it's not one of the essential six. It's just projecting it outward. So on one hand, it's not as important as the other ones. But on the other hand, it's actually very important. So let me give you an example. If a person is by themselves, right? If I'm on my own, I don't need to speak, right? I don't have to speak to anybody. Speech is the way I communicate to somebody else. So on one hand, Malchut, my ability to speak, my ability to influence others is considered the lowest sphera. It's the lowest dimension of my soul because it's not essential to myself. It's outward of myself. So on one hand, Malchut, my capacity to speak, to inspire people, to affect my environment is the lowest of my sphirot, because in the Kabbalah, the closer you get to your essence, the higher it is. The more it's projected outward, the lower it is. So Malchut, the ability to speak, on one hand is very low. It's not essential to myself. On the other hand, as we will discuss, there is a Kabbalistic principle. And the Kabbalistic principle goes something as follows. It says the end is rooted in the beginning and the beginning is rooted in the end. Meaning to say that the deepest parts of your soul express themselves not necessarily within your higher faculties, but within your lower faculties. In other words, the essence of the soul expresses itself in speech or how you relate to other people. And I'm going to try to bring a few examples, and then we'll see what we can make of this. So the Kabbalah says as follows. On one hand, what is speech? As we mentioned before, speech is nothing. What is speech? Speech is in itself. It has nothing. All it is a vessel to convey an idea. If I have an idea, I could speak it. If I have an emotion, I could speak it. Just words for themselves but have no meaning is purposeless. Even though on TV, there are a lot of people who make a lot of money for talking without conveying any meaning, right? Let's say something they have a guest and the programming and have a technical difficulty and the guest falls off and they have to fill some time. So they start talking and then you're listening and then you ask yourself, what is this guy saying, right? So the point is, speech on itself is nothing. It's just a container. So the container has to have something within it. So speech in itself really doesn't, all it is, it projects, it's like the moon. It projects the light of the higher faculties, either an idea or an emotion. Fine. On the other hand, you cannot just say that speech, all it is a projector, because speech actually has a fascinating characteristic. And that is that the more you speak, the more you're drawing down from the essence of your soul. And to illustrate this, you will see that if you have an idea and you think about it to yourself and you understand it, that's okay. But if you explain it to somebody else, if you articulate it in speech, you will actually understand it better than had you not ever spoken those words. So what do you see? You see speech, even though on the surface it's just expressing, it doesn't really have anything on its own, it doesn't have anything of its own light. Nevertheless, it actually intensifies the light of the idea. The same thing is with emotion. If I have an emotion and I speak it, what happens is I'm actually adding fuel to the emotion. That's why the Kabbalists say, if you're angry at somebody, don't speak. You should wait. Wait till the intensity of the passion passes. Wait a minute before you respond. Because if I'm angry and I talk, it's like pouring kerosene on a fire. Okay, so because speech is rooted in the essence of the soul, speech has this paradox. On one hand, it has nothing, it's just a container. On the other hand, it draws down a tremendous amount of energy and it intensifies both the idea and the emotion. Now, just like God creates with his speech, we also create with our speech. When we speak and articulate our ideas in a certain way, it actually affects the environment, it affects our mood, it affects the people around us. And if we are to create in this world, the way we do it is by articulating ideas into words. So if I speak kindly, I'm creating an environment of kindness in my environment. If I speak harshly, I'm creating harshness in my environment. So just like God creates through speech, we too create through speech as well. One more component, and here we're getting a little mystical and a little bit about relationships, but that was the request yesterday. So we'll spend a minute or two on this, a few minutes on this, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. Okay. According to the Kabbalists and the early philosophers, they divided the world creations into four categories, into four kingdoms. So they have the inanimate kingdom, domain. Then they have tzomeach, the vegetable kingdom, things that grow. Then they have the chai, animals, living beings, animals. And then finally, they have the human beings. So if you had to come up with a name to classify, how would you define human beings? What quality would you choose? So domain is inanimate. Tzomeach grows. So grow is a nice way to classify everything that grows. Chai, life. Animals are alive. And then if you had to come up with a name that explains what is a name for humanity, what would you choose? So most people would say we have intelligence, right? Most people will say the human being can think abstractly. The animal can't do abstract mathematics. We could. So most people would expect that the Kabbalistic name for the humanity should be the ones who can think. But that's not accurate. What the Kabbalah says about the human being, we call it midaber, the speaker. The human being is the species that can talk. Now, what's so great about talking? We just finished saying that speech, Malchut, is actually the lowest component of the human soul. All it is projecting ideas outward. But what about the ideas themselves? What about the higher emotions themselves? So this is a question. Why does the Kabbalah explain that we are, even though we do have intelligence and advanced and abstract intelligence, but our superiority, what defines us, what defines a human being as a human being is speaker. We can convey this to somebody else. So the Kabbalah says as follows. The true essence of spirituality is if I could transcend myself. And all the other soul powers, I'm preoccupied with myself, how I feel, how I connect to others. But speech is my capacity to transcend myself and unite with somebody else. That makes me the most spiritual because, again, the definition of spirituality is not being tied down to one specific place. A physical entity takes up a certain physical space. A spiritual entity takes up also a physical space, a spiritual space. It's a dimension. But if I'm truly spiritual, then I could break free of my specific definition. So if I could escape myself and relate to you and talk to you, I'm actually freeing myself spiritually. I'm becoming more spiritual because I'm becoming less defined within my own personhood, in my own personality. And again, we said Malchut is the lowest part of the soul, but it's rooted in the deepest part of my soul. The deepest part of my soul wants to connect to somebody else. Now, the deepest part of my soul, we'll call it Keter, crown. The crown, the Kabbalah says, the deepest part of my soul is pleasure. Okay? Now we have all the pieces of the puzzle to put everything together. Let's put everything together here. Where is the greatest pleasure that a human being could achieve? The greatest pleasure a human being could achieve is sexual intimacy, right? So it's the bonding of Yesod and Malchut. In some sense, Yesod Malchut is the masculine reproductive organ and the feminine reproductive organ. So it's uniting the masculine and feminine. In other words, giver and recipient. And the greatest pleasure is present at that union. Why is the greatest pleasure present at that union? Because we just finished saying what the core of your soul wants, and the core of your soul is pleasure. What the core of your soul wants, it wants to transcend itself and connect to somebody else because then it's free. So the core of your soul wants to be selfless. And when it becomes selfless, it connects to somebody else. But it has to become, but it's connected to a physical act because, as we said, the most lofty and the most physical are rooted within each other. Now, the act of intimacy is very tricky. On one hand, it can cause a person to be tremendous amount of pleasure. It's also in Judaism, not in other faiths, but in Judaism, it's actually considered holy. The act of intimacy is called Kedusha, holiness. Why holiness? Same idea. What is holiness? Holiness means transcending myself. If I transcend myself in the physical union, I am becoming holy. So on one hand, it creates a tremendous amount of pleasure in holiness. On the other hand, it can be very frustrating, and it can cause a tremendous amount of anxiety. And also, it can actually make the person very selfish. The same act could be selfless, could be spiritual, or it could actually be make the person selfish and make the person animalistic. And how does that work? And that's why if a person is only, so the way that works is as follows. If the act of intimacy is a moment where a person could transcend himself, and that's why the soul is present, and that's why the soul is has so much pleasure. Imagine if someone turns that around and focuses it inward. I'm here only for my own pleasure. I'm not here for the other person. I'm not here for any spiritual purpose. So now I'm taking the deepest part of my soul, which seeks to escape the self, and I'm focusing it only at myself. For the soul, that creates terrible frustration. And that's why even physically and psychologically, it trickles down and it creates frustration within the person. So to summarize, what we're saying is Malchut is the ability to speak, the ability to communicate, the ability to connect to somebody else, and that's at its height is the physical act of intimacy. And at those moments, what happens is the deepest part of the soul is present, because the deepest part of the soul is present in the most physical part of life, and it also uses that to escape, to transcend itself, and become more spiritual by connecting to somebody else. Now, that intense power could be used again to free myself of ego, or to focus, or on the other hand, if it's used in the negative, it can actually intensify my ego, which creates a bigger problem. So in other words, like everything else in life, the more spiritual potential something has, the more potential it also has to go negative. And here we have to use our wisdom to make sure that within the union with somebody else, we do it for a spiritual purpose, thinking about the other person with respect. And from the Kabbalistic perspective, just one more component, Kabbalistic perspective, in the act of intimacy, a person also has to realize that just like we reflect the divine also reflects us. So if a person has the act of intimacy with holiness, that also creates the unity between and the source, between Malchut and the first 6 Sfirot. And what that does, it creates the unity with the